morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Michelle Scholes. I work here at the Environmental Learning Center, which is on the campus of Clackamas Community College, up in Portland area near Oregon City. This week, we are into our fourth week of wildlife and water-friendly gardens, and we have a wonderful guest speaker today that will be introduced in a moment. To get into our presentation, I would first of all like to thank the sponsors shown with their logos on the screen there, especially to Clackamas Water Environment Services. We have Gail Shalom from there to speak with us to introduce today. Also, I'd like to thank our partners, Oak Lodge Water Services, Great Oregon City Watershed Council, North Clackamas Watersheds Council, Tryon Creek Watershed Council, Clackamas River Basin Council, and Clackamas River Water Providers. So with that, because I know time is limited, I will turn things over to Alexis from Tryon Creek, who will introduce our speakers. Thanks, Alexis.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle, and thanks everybody for being here. As Michelle said, it's my pleasure to get to introduce our speakers, but before I do that, just a couple brief housekeeping notes. All of you are doing a really great job so far by having your microphones muted, so we're not picking up any household or background noise on your end. So please do keep those mics muted and use the chat box. So some of you guys have been chiming in with what your soil type is in the chat already, which is great. And as you have questions during today's workshop, please put them in chat, and I will be taking those and then reiterating and sharing them with Logan at the end. And Gail might tune in again at the end too. So Gail Shalom is a natural resources scientist and landscape architect at Clackamas Water Environment Services since 2011. Gail manages projects including stream and wetland restoration projects, biological and habitat monitoring, the River Health Stewardship Grant Program, and the Watershed Health Education Program. She has over 30 years of experience in water management, stream restoration, wetland mitigation, NEPA compliance, and low-impact development practices in both the public and private sectors. Gail is a graduate of Rutgers University and Oregon Graduate Institute. We're joined today by Logan Bennett, who holds a master's degree in soil science and a bachelor's in natural resources management. Logan has 3 years of experience as an extension agent at Oregon State University, working as part of the Small Farms and Master Gardeners program. Previously, Logan worked as a crop consultant specializing in perennial crops. And Logan's interests include direct farm marketing, soil science, perfect for today, hogs, poultry, blueberries, and apples. Logan has expertise in soils, integrated pest management, permanent cropping systems, and small fruits, making him a valuable resource for farmers and gardeners alike. So thank you all so very much for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Gail for our watershed-based introduction, who will then pass it to Logan. And I'll be collecting our Q&As via chat as we go, and looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you, Alexis. Hello, everybody. I'm Gail Shalom with Clackamas Water Environment Services, also known as WES. WES produces clean water, protects water quality, and recovers renewable resources. And we do this by providing wastewater services, stormwater management, and environmental education, like the webinar going on today. It's our job to protect public health and support the vitality of our communities, natural environment, and economy. So let's get into the presentation. Next slide, please. And first, I want to tell you a little bit about stormwater runoff, and I will relate this to soils in just a few minutes. For those not familiar with the term, stormwater runoff is rainfall that flows over the ground surface. It's created when rain falls on roads, driveways, parking lots, rooftops, really any surface that does not allow the water to soak into the ground. Stormwater runoff is the #1 cause of water pollution and stream damage in urban areas now. Where rain falls on paved surfaces, a much greater volume of runoff is generated compared to runoff from the same storm falling on a vegetated area. These large volumes of water are carried very quickly to our local streams, wetlands, and rivers, and so they can cause flooding and erosion, and they can wash away important habitat for our critters that live in the stream. And that includes threatened and endangered species of salmon that we still have in many of our Pacific Northwest streams. Next slide, please. Stormwater also picks up and carries with it many different pollutants that are found on the ground, such as sediment, nitrogen, phosphorus, bacteria, oils and grease, trash, pesticides, metals, things like that. And these pollutants can come from a variety of sources like pet waste, lawn fertilization, cars, construction sites, illegal dumping, accidental spills, pesticide application. At WES, we say if it's on the ground, it's in the water. Next slide, please. So what does stormwater have to do with soils? Well, soils play a critical role in stormwater management because soil influences infiltration, how quickly the water can soak into the ground, and it stores water, thereby reducing runoff. It can also remove pollutants from stormwater, and it supports healthy ecosystems. A healthy soil can help replenish our groundwater by allowing the water to soak in, and then the water can move very gradually under the ground towards our local water body and can contribute base flow to our rivers and streams in the summer, when it's so dry, when they need it the most. Next slide. So thank you very much for being here today to learn more about soils and what actions you can take to make a difference. We really need everyone to do their part in keeping our watersheds healthy, which is why we say the river starts here, because it starts with us. And now on to our feature presentation with Logan.
Thank you for that. And good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the presentation. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about soils. So we're going to go over some stuff on formation, and we're going to talk about how to keep your soils healthy. First, I'm starting with a quote that I really enjoy. Land, then, is not merely soil. It is a fountain of energy flowing through a circuit of soils, plants, and animals. And I kind of like to think of soil as a holistic system. We want to think about what we're putting into it, what we're taking out of it, and how we're utilizing the soil and stewarding it to make sure that we keep a healthy landscape. So what is soil? Soil is a living, breathing ecological system consisting of inorganic minerals, organic matter, living organisms, plants, roots, water, and air. That's a mouthful, right? Essentially, soil is essential for healthy plants and a healthy planet. Let's talk a little bit about the taxonomy of soils. Just like there's a taxonomy for organisms, there's a taxonomy for soils. We have 12 soil orders, and the most arable lands in the world rest on mollisols, followed by alphasols. Earlier, we asked you what kind of soil you have, and one of the reasons for that is because the Willamette Valley specifically has a huge deposit of these mollisols and alphasols as a result of the Missoula floods. So these soils, which are some of the most fertile in the world, are very commonly found where a lot of you may be right now. Willamette Valley has a lot of those mollisols. Where I'm at in Douglas County, we have mollisols, we have alphasols. Those are both farming soils. We also have a lot of vertisols. So for those of you in the chat that said your soil's straight clay, that may be a vertisol. And then altisols. Altisols are the ultimate in soil weathering, except for they're not. They're the second ultimate in soil weathering, but it helps remember it. Our state soil is actually an altisol. Anyone ever heard of Jory before? It's a good wine soil. That's our state soil. So what are the essential functions of the soil? Well, it's a medium for plant growth, a regulator for water and nutrients, a recycler for raw material, habitat for soil organisms, landscaping and engineering medium, and its historical archive. And we can go through that in a little more detail. So some of the ecosystem services that soils have are provisioning, regulating, cultural services, and supporting services. And what does that mean? Well, let's drill down on it a little bit. Soil has a lot of provisioning services. So we obtain a lot of things from soil and the ecosystem that it provides. So food, fiber, water, building materials, energy, and biofuels are all byproducts of a healthy soil. It also provides a lot of regulating services. So climate regulation, carbon sequestration, soils actually sequester quite a bit of carbon. Hazard noise regulation, it also helps with pollution, and waste regulation, purification of water. Soil acts as a big water filter, air and other contaminants, and once again, water purification. We also get a lot of cultural benefits from soil. So soil is the foundation of almost all civilizations. There's a lot of cultural heritage within soil, including utilization of soil in spiritual and religious activities. And soil is a good place to recreate, right? We choose to hang out on places that function in a way that we want to recreate. In the woods, whether it's a grassy field or out on the beach, all of those are either soils or byproducts of. They also have a lot of supporting services. So soils contribute a lot to primary production. So thinking about growing plants, decomposition, getting rid of the things that have either died or turning them into fertilizer, more soil formation, nutrient cycling, and water cycling. So what I'm kind of getting at here is that soils are very key in a lot of the things that we use day to day, and we may not even know it. So it's really important for us to want to keep a healthy soil. So how do we keep healthy soils? Healthy soils are abundant and diverse in beneficial organisms, and we can help that by growing a diversity of plants and making sure that we're utilizing plants that help add healthy organisms to the soil. We try to keep soils that are healthy, few of pests and pathogens. There's a variety of ways that you can do that. That's a whole talk in itself, but one way to look at doing that is keeping the soil covered with living plants or mulch. Soils contain a large amount of small pores and large pores that promote drainage and aeration. So we want a really diverse soil pore profile. And one way to really help with that is growing living roots throughout the year. And we also want soil that's resistant to compaction and erosion and that recovers from disturbance and any kind of disturbance. You may have noticed when you were walking outside recently after a rain, if you step on the soil, it actually makes an imprint of your foot. That is soil disturbance, and we're actually compacting pores there. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing that you walked on the soil, but we want to be able to help our soil be able to return from that state. So we want to help the soil be able to recover from disturbance. And one of the ways to do that is minimizing that disturbance. So I'm not necessarily saying no-till. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But reducing the amount of impact that we have on the soil, whether it's through strategy tilling or no-till, can be really good for that soil. So how does all of this form? Soils form through additions, which is the accumulation of plant debris and minerals, like this mountain here that is slowly turning into soil. Losses, so erosion, evaporation, oxidation, and wind. Oxygen does break down elements, eventually turns them into soil over a period of a long time. Translocation, soils can move downward, upward, or laterally. And transformation, so as rocks break down, they change from one component into another. There are four main components of soil: mineral, organic material, water, and air. And the one that we typically look at the most is the mineral component. So what are the mineral parts of soil, and how do we figure out what kind of soil that we have? So what are those mineral components? We have sand, silt, and clay. So sand is the largest of those components, between 0.05 and 2 millimeters in diameter. In the world of soil, that's like a boulder. It's huge. Think of that like a car. Silt is much smaller. It's 0.002 to 0.05 millimeters in diameter. And it kind of feels floury when dry, smooth, or wet. So if you're hand texturing, you can kind of feel it. In my car comparison, this may be the size of like a wagon tire. And then we have clay, which is very, very small, less than 0.002 millimeters in diameter. And it feels smooth when dry and slick and sticky when wet. So these are the three main mineral components of soil. And I should note that sand and silt are just particle sizes. So anything can be sand and silt, whether it is broken down glass, which we commonly think of as sand, whether it is a piece of plastic, part of a tire, a toucan's beak, anything that is between 0.05 and 2 millimeters is sand, as anything between 0.002 and 0.05 millimeters is silt. You might notice I didn't mention clay. We'll get to that soon. So how do we figure out what soil texture we have? This is a soil texture triangle. It's one of my favorite things in the world because this is so handy. You can take the percentage of sand and silt or sand and clay and determine with those two variables what kind of soil you have. Whether you have a clay, a silt loam, a sandy loam, or anywhere in between, this is the tool to get you there. And this texture tool gives us a lot of hints about what our soil is capable of. It can tell us what our drainage is, what our cation exchange capacity is, what the arability is, the ability of growing and farming on that land, and also the capacity for non-agricultural things like buildings, wetlands, such as that. So this is a little bit of an aside, but I'm in agriculture, so I like silty soils. My brother is in engineering, so he doesn't like silty soils. Because very silty soils aren't super great for building on. Silt can turn non-Newtonian when it's disturbed. So how do we determine those soil textures? There's two ways to do that. In the lab, we often use a hydrometer. So we use something called sodium hexametaphosphate, and we mix that with the soil, and it gives us precise textural analysis of that soil. However, in the field, you can also do hand texturing. So you can feel it and kind of determine what kind of soil you have based on the feel of it. Okay, let's break down that textural analysis a little bit more and talk about those different size classes. So rock is a primary mineral. It breaks down over time through processes like weathering. And there's two main forms of weathering, chemical and physical weathering. Chemical weathering of rocks is a reaction to the change of formation of rocks, causing the dissolution of minerals into the ecosystem. Hydration, hydrolysis, breaking down by water, carbonation, so weak carbonic acids dissolve over time. This is usually created by H2O, acidification, and oxidation, so rocks can actually rust. Then we have the physical and mechanical weathering of rocks. So this is a picture I took on a shovel next to a riverbed. It's kind of crazy to think that those rocks that are on the tip of that shovel at one point were giant boulders and are probably hundreds of thousands of years old. They can break down through physical manipulation, freezing and thawing, abrasion like wind, thermal expansion when it gets really hot, really cold, and exfoliation. So when the earth actually uplifts, it can actually change or grind down those rocks. So when rocks break down, they turn into sand and silt, those size classes we talked about. But what about clay? So clay is a secondary mineral. It's not the same as sand and silt, so it's not just a size class. It breaks down through a process called isomorphic substitution. Iso being same, morphic being changing. The rocks that are broken down turn into microscopic material, and then they change mineralogically. So they can actually become remade. Those minerals break down and reform. So primary rock turns into a dissolved mineral through physical and chemical weathering. And then from that primary mineral, it recrystallizes into a flat surface. So sheets of silica, aluminum oxide. And those flat surfaces are actually negatively charged. They're also tremendous. So these have a high potential to hold a lot of cations, positively charged ions. We'll get to why that matters in just a moment here. So when we're looking at a soil horizon, we have an O layer, we have an A layer. So O layer is like debris, litter, organic material. The A layer is the surface horizon where we typically think of dark colored granular soil. Then B is where that clay typically develops, and C is the weathered parent material. And then below that we have bedrock. The O layer and the A layer are what we are mostly focused on when we're talking about soil mitigation, growing plants, growing food, growing native plants, that kind of stuff. And the structure within that A layer is really important. So this picture is showing lettuce seedlings at 3 weeks old. They're a comparison of compacted soil and non-compacted soil. So this is where we get back to what happens when we're compacting that soil. So soil is an arrangement of particles that we call PEDs that allow the movement of air, water, and roots. And compaction, when we step on the soil, when we drive on it, when we till through it, can squeeze those pores together. It can cause less water movement and less root penetration. And when we're compacting that soil, we actually cause something called a plow pan. So here's an example of that, what non-compacted versus compacted soil may do. So excessive tilling, note that I said excessive, can cause destruction of soil structure. Things like gravity and rainfall can compress soil, so we're never going to completely get rid of compressing soil. And excess weight can physically compact the soil too. So walking on it, or if we use heavy equipment. So if we're over-tilling, if we're driving too many vehicles on it, that can compact soil as well. Okay, now that we have some background, how do we keep the soil healthy? What do we do to make sure that we are promoting as much of soil health as we can to make sure that we're growing and reducing rainfall? So this is a really nice little infographic from the Natural Resource Conservation Service that kind of gives a big picture view on what we should be focusing on if we're trying to maintain a healthy soil and reduce erosion, reduce water loss and soil loss. So the first thing I'll start with is minimizing disturbance. And I have a picture of farmers here that are working in a commercial field, but we can take those principles and apply them to our own backyards. So no-till or minimal tillage can help reduce soil disturbance. Both are much better than excessive tilling, and they're both pretty viable in a backyard situation. So no tillage is something that requires a little extra work. You can choose plant crops, like for example, daikon radish can help you in a no tillage situation to make sure that you're still growing stuff that's breaking apart the soil and allowing for those pores to form. And then minimum tillage just means tilling all that you need to. So most of the time when we're preparing a garden bed or a farm bed, we tend to over-till a little bit. Most of the time, we don't need as many passes as we think we do. So getting aware of that and reducing the amount of passes on a tiller or switching to something like a disker can really help reduce that compaction. This also helps us reduce erosion, and we can leave thatch on the ground if it's disease-free, and that can actually work as a weed mat for us. So if we've got thatch cuttings from the plants that we grew the year previous, we can actually use that as an organic weed mat. We also want to try to maximize biodiversity on the farm or in the garden. So if you have an area where you can have livestock, they can actually provide you with fertilizer via their manure. So chickens work well, so do cattle. The thing about chicken manure is we want to be paying attention to it. It's relatively what we'd call hot in terms of nutrients. So it's a 9-aught. Sometimes it's different than that, but commonly that's what we look at. And that means 9% nitrogen. So you want to try to compost that down if you can, or mix it in with something else, because that manure can actually be a little too high in nitrogen. We can also maximize biodiversity in our farms or gardens without the use of livestock. And the way to do that would be planting a lot of plants. So trying to choose plants that fit the soil profile, i.e. choosing native plants or plants that grow well in your environment, can help with that. And it just allows for different microbial communities to thrive within the soil, and it's keeping living roots in the ground, so we're reducing erosion at the same time. In areas that we don't have plants, we can try to maximize soil cover. So what we want to try to do in general is avoid fallow soil. And fallow, in this case, means bare ground. So we want to try to avoid having bare ground when we can. So that can mean mulching if we're not planting there. So you can use leaf matter, wood chips. There's plastic and fabric soil covers that can be used. All of that will help reduce the amount of erosion that you get. And we also want to keep living roots in the ground. So plant a crop. And if you can't, plant a cover crop. So sometimes right now, especially like if we're growing gardens for vegetables and such, there may not be many options to plant depending on your situation. And if that's the case, there are a lot of different cover crops, forage crops, things like that you can plant and keep a living root in the ground. So plant roots act like an anchor and help us keep our soil where it is, reduce that erosion. So more roots, less erosion, healthier soils. And another thing that we want to remember throughout all of this is that soil is habitat. So when you look close at a soil, it kind of looks like a metropolis, right? Over here on the screen, we've got all of these different organisms surviving in this soil. Animals, earthworms, arthropods, vertebrates. We've got microorganisms like bacteria and fungi, and plant roots that all work together in an ecosystem to hold that soil together kind of like a glue. So we want to try to maximize that habitat underground as much as we can to keep our soils healthy and in place. So here we just have bacteria, actinomycetes, mycorrhizae, saprophytic fungi, nematodes, protozoa, and mites. There's a lot going on under the ground. I've heard estimates before that in a teaspoon of soil, there may be up to 1 million organisms, sometimes more depending on where you're at. So there's a lot going on underneath us that we want to try to encourage. A variety of these microorganisms compose the living elements of soil and organic matter. So remember earlier I said that soil is a living, breathing organism. Now there's a little bit of back to that. We want to think about what that living, breathing organism looks like and how we help it to function. So outside of the things that we've discussed already, one of the main components of keeping soils healthy is organic matter. So organic matter comes in a lot of different forms. Leaf litter, recently deceased microorganisms, plants or animals, or fresh manure. And maximizing the organic matter that we keep in our properties can be a very good way to help our soils survive. All of those millions of living organisms in the soil do eventually die, and they're decomposing, along with fallen leaves, twigs, dead plants, and fresh manures. These contribute to the organic matter or the dead component of soil. These items are all sources of food and a variety of microbes. These microbes in turn can help us break down nitrogen, phosphorus, and other materials contained within the dead organic matter and make it available to plants. So as this stuff breaks down, it actually can turn into fertilizer for the plants that we have there. So as icky as it might sound, all these decomposers weren't working away beneath our feet, our world and would be awash if we didn't have them. So what I'm saying there is if we didn't have decomposers in the soil and we didn't have things to feed them like organic matter, we may be in trouble. So we want to maximize having that decomposition. So organic matter decomposes, and when it decomposes tremendously, it turns into something called humus. And soil humus is a really important factor in plant growth. So we want to make sure that we're maximizing the amount of humus that we have in soil organic matter. This also provides chemical properties, so it contributes to our cation exchange capacity, how much that soil can exchange with cations and anions, i.e. how much fertility we can pull out of that soil. And it buffers the soil against changes in pH. And depending on what you're growing, that can be really important. So for example, if you like rhododendrons or blueberries, they require a really low pH. So a pH of 4.2 to 5.2 in some cases. So we want to make sure that when we have our soil at the pH that we want it at, we can keep it there. On the opposite side of that, most of the vegetable crops we grow don't do well at pHs and the 4s for sure, and even in the 5s. So knowing what pH you have and then buffering it to keep it in that direction can be a really good thing. So what else does organic matter do for us? It's a source of nutrients. It also helps retain nutrients and water. It also improves soil structure and porosity and improves the water holding capacity by quite a bit. Some estimates are upwards of 200 times, and it improves that kind of cation exchange capacity. So let's talk a little bit about that water holding capacity. So these are two different soils, 25 years of conventional corn on the left side and 20 years of bluegrass, then 5 years of conventional corn on the right side. And what we're looking at here is essentially the difference in management styles. So a heavily managed, often tilled system on the left versus a low management, low till system on the right. So obviously you can't unmute and answer me, but what do you think will happen once we add water to these? So once water is added, you can see the effect of the organic matter on the water holding capacity. In the low organic matter sample, which is the 25 years conventional corn, the soil immediately dissolves into a very fine formless texture. So it doesn't hold up to those structures, those PEDs we talked about earlier, they don't stick around. And excess water just sits on top, so it floods and then it starts having runoff. In a field, so if we're looking at this in our backyards or on a commercial field, much of that water would run off into the rest of the ecosystem, and it's going to take a lot of that soil with it. So we want to be really careful about allowing our soils to get here. So by contrast, the high organic matter field, that's the one that had bluegrass, lower tillage, and then corn, it absorbed a lot of that water. And that's mainly because of the organic components. They absorbed the water and then it went into the soil particles after that. And although both of these are from a farm field, it shows that there's a way to manage your garden soil so it can have a similar impact on its water holding capacity. So this is where we start to think about adding organic matter, reducing the amount of tillage, and keeping living roots in the ground at all times. So those living roots that we were talking about earlier, whether it be from a crop or a cover crop or a permanent plant, permanent structure, native plant, something like that, those help keep those microorganisms in balance. It helps keep the soil healthy and alive, and it helps keeping that glue formed that we talked about earlier. And then also including that organic matter in your soil is really important for keeping these structures rigid and keeping them healthy, so that when you do have an event like this, whether it be heavy rains or overwatering, something like that, that your soil beds hold together well. So how do we encourage high soil organic matter at our own homes? The positive benefits of soil organic matter on plant health are many, so we want to make sure that we have a lot of organic matter. So first, we can avoid tillage, use no tillage methods when possible, or use low tillage methods. When we till, we're adding a lot of oxygen to the soil, which increases the speed of decomposition, which can increase the loss of organic matter. It can also damage soil aggregate structure if we do it too often. So we can reduce the amount of tillage or eliminate it if we can. Another thing is reducing or eliminating chemical pesticides. So this isn't a talk saying that you shouldn't ever spray. The idea here would be implementing an integrated pest management plan. So using mechanical, cultural, or physical controls or biological controls before chemical controls can reduce the impact on your soil's health. We typically look at chemical controls when we have to use them, so they're a last option. Another thing we can do is leave grass clippings and leaves in the backyard. So referring back to the previous bullet there, as long as we're not using long-term chemicals on the lawn, the lawn clippings can actually be a good mulch to use, and same with leaves. And then adding compost is an important thing to do. So adding that organic matter, often in the forms of compost, can be a really good thing for your soil. Now, I will put an asterisk on that compost part. If we're adding compost every year, you will want to take a soil sample and kind of get an idea of where you're at in terms of nutrient levels. Compost typically has a high level of phosphorus in it, and phosphorus is a non-mobile nutrient, so it stacks up year after year. So if you use too much compost, you can actually end up with a high phosphorus content in your soil, and over time that can be detrimental. So I'm certainly not discouraging the use of compost. Just use it wisely and make sure to test your soil. And this boils down to kind of the best practices when we're talking about soil and nutrient management. So when we're talking about fertilization, using compost, using pesticides, anything like that, we want to make sure that we're using the right source. So if we're using fertilizer, for example, whether you're using organic or conventional fertilizer, make sure that it matches the type of nutrient that the crop needs. We want to use the right rate, match the amount of fertilizer that what we're planting needs. So if we over-fertilize, not only can we harm the plants, we can actually harm the soil. We want to make sure that we're using it at the right time. So adding too much fertilizer or chemical in this case at the wrong time can damage the plant or do nothing, and it gets translated back into the soil. And then the other thing is using it at the right place. So especially when it comes to non-mobile nutrients like phosphorus, if we're applying it farther away from the crop or our plants that we're intending to grow, it won't do much good. I know that we are on a specific schedule, so we'll leave a lot of time open for questions here, but I did want to just show this photo. These are all pictures of different soils that I've collected in my work. So the blue and purple ones are high aluminum content, and on the adverse side, the red ones are high iron content. And that shows in the middle is something sort of in between, right? That's actually a Dixonville, and the picture doesn't do it as much justice as I'd like, but towards the bottom of that soil, it actually turns almost highlighter yellow. So there's a lot of diversity in soil types. And these are also clues, right? So when we see a soil that's blue that has a high aluminum content, we can tell that that's an anoxic soil. And that will have a different effect on the crops you're trying to grow than the soil that's on the left here, the red soil. That's a high iron soil. Those have different pHs, they have different oxygen contents, and they have different abilities. So when we're thinking about matching plants back to the soil that we're growing in, we want to think about what will succeed in a low oxygen environment, what will succeed in a high clay environment, or what will succeed somewhere in the middle. All right, I think with that, we can open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Logan. That's awesome. That was so much information, and we've had a lot of questions roll through. So I'm excited for a kind of bustling Q&A period. So for folks that haven't already put your questions in chat, or you're going to start doing so, it might take me a little bit longer to circle back to those. So let's see here. Going to start with a couple quick basic ones. Could you talk about the difference between tilling and disking, please?
Sure. So tilling and disking are both forms of sort of mixing up the soil to make it softer to plant in. The main difference is the angle and the shape of the tool being used. So tillage typically comes in the form of blades that press down and pull the soil out, sort of in this motion. And that, while effective on making that top few inches sort of soft and fluffy to plant in, it also has a downward motion that kind of compacts the soil as it moves forward. So it can actually kind of beat on the soil, and that causes a lot of compaction. We actually have observed a phenomena where places are tilled often, they end up with something called a plow pan. And it's usually about 10 inches down. And that's where the soil becomes almost like concrete after it's been tilled so many times. And that gets really hard for, let me restate that. It makes it hard for water to penetrate through that and for plant roots to penetrate through that. So once you have a plow pan and it rains a bunch, you have this issue where the water is then circling back up to the top of the soil and then carrying off soil through erosion. The main difference with disking is sort of at a diagonal angle. And so the impact when you're moving through with the discs is lesser than tilling. And it's also a different shape. So instead of those blades, it kind of looks like a record.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. And relatedly, as far as the shape of things going into soil, could you talk about the impact of turning over soil versus making vertical channels with the spading fork and how those disturb the soil?
Ooh, good question.
Yeah,
So like
and
turning with a broad fork?
they said spading fork. I'm not sure if that's one way or the other, but they asked because they've read that soil microbes tend to be stratified by soil depth.
Ooh, oh, we're getting intense. Okay.
I'll reel us back to an easy one after this.
Okay. So depending on the soil microbe, you're right. Some may be stratified, but not all soil microbes are. Turning with a broad fork does definitely have, or a spade fork definitely has a benefit that you're putting less impact on the soil. A person manually turning over soil definitely has less impact than a tractor would, for example. And when you turn your soil, there is going to be some air exposure, and that could change the microbial community a little bit. But in comparison to using heavy machinery, I would say overall, it's less impact total.
Awesome. Thanks very much. Let's see. Gail chimed in with a resource from NCAP on recommendations for treating moss, but someone was asking how does iron application, or maybe just metals generally, how does that affect the soil for
Great
moss?
question. So there's iron and a few other metal applications that can be used on moss. I should have put a link in the chat, but there's a really great resource called Solve Pest Problems that is awesome for looking for these kind of recommendations, like specifically for moss. There's some other things that you can use depending on where you're at. So for example, if it's in a driveway, you can power wash moss off. There's also some recommendations for oils and some different kinds of chemicals and less risky chemicals to use that can be helpful. The main thing in terms of metals in soils, so often we use something like copper as a pesticide in soils, or excuse me, not in soils, on plants. those can accumulate over time. So if you're using something that will end up in the soil, whether it be iron, copper, or a different metal, you want to just monitor that and see if you're getting a rise over time.
Okay. Great. And keeping track of the impacts of different chemicals, could you please talk more about how chemical pesticides affect soil?
Yeah, that is a broad question. And depending on the chemical, there are a lot of different answers to it. So it's one of those, I suppose the way to say it is there's a risk factor, and we just want to make sure that we're mitigating that risk. So not overusing any particular kind of pesticide. If we are using pesticides, make sure to switch out your chemistries so that we're not having a large impact of one particular chemical in the soil. And keeping track of what you use are all really important. I think that question's a little bit too broad to answer what a chemical specific might do to a soil, but some chemicals will have more intense impacts than others.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Let's see. Um, Trying to figure out if there's anything super connected before I share a different question.
All good.
All right, yeah, scaling it back. Also, Gail has come through in the chat with the links to the Solve Pest Problems
Awesome.
website.
Thank you, Gail.
Yeah, fantastic. Uh, could you talk about, or could you maybe share tips, let's see, on composting chicken manure? So someone was
Sure.
asking, yeah, they were asking if they should add more brown material to balance out the nitrogen and how to tell when it's ready to move into a bed.
Good question. I like this question. So any kind of manure that you're composting, we want to make sure that we're composting it with brown parts. Somebody asked, or somebody said brown parts, and I'll explain that. There's two kind of large parts of compost. There's green and brown. Green is typically what we think of like our plant material. Sometimes it's manure, sometimes it's not. So oftentimes literally green things, and those are high in nitrogen. Brown is typically high in carbon. So oftentimes we're thinking cardboard, newspaper, sometimes wood chips. That's an asterisk there. And a few other things that are just higher in carbon. And typically the goal is to get a 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen ratio when we're making compost. And compost typically goes through 3 sort of steps before we use it. So there's brand new material that gets put in one pile. And then you flip that after a couple weeks into a new pile, which is composting material. And then after that, it gets flipped into a finishing pile. And you should monitor your compost the way I do it. We produce a lot of compost at our Discovery Garden. The way we do it is based on temperature. Our goal is to get up to 150, 160 maybe degrees. And then when it starts to come down, we turn that compost. Compost thermometers are super easy to get. I think they're available online now. So that's a good way to monitor your compost. Otherwise, you should turn it on a schedule of maybe every 2 weeks, depending on what your compost looks like as you make it. We can have another talk about that, but there's ways to tell if your compost has too much green, too much brown, too much carbon, too much nitrogen, and adjust for that. Chicken manure is something that typically we compost for longer than regular compost, and that's because A, there's a risk of disease, and B, because it's so high nitrogen. I would turn that maybe several more times before you use it.
Okay, thank you. Should you turn leaves left on soil each year?
Good question. So there's a common sentiment you may have heard that says leave the leaves. And that can be a beneficial thing for sure. So I think the sort of threshold on whether or not to pick up the leaves or leave them as a mulch was the tree that dropped them diseased? So the main thing we don't want to do is leave inoculum on the ground, especially with some fungal diseases. They can actually, once the leaves touch the ground, they can create storage bodies and survive in the soil until the next spring. So that's the thing with mummyberry and blueberries. So for example, if you have blueberries that had mummyberry, you would want to make sure to rake up and destroy those leaves. But if you have healthy leaves or healthy trees that are dropping leaves, oftentimes they can be a good mulch. There are some exceptions to that. So if you have walnut trees or if you have cedar boughs that are dropping, those may be something that you might want to pick up. Some plants have allelopathy, so they produce oils or other things that can be harmful to plants that aren't them. But overall, yes, leaves are typically a good option for mulch.
Wonderful, thank you. There are a lot of really great questions. So I'm going to try and I think I'll lump two questions about folks dealing with clay, and then there's going to be about 4 or 5 questions that are kind of more urban, maybe edible garden based.
Sure.
So one of the clay questions was, look, someone's looking for input on best practices or materials to improve drainage quickly for planting in heavy clay soil. They wrote that they've added plenty of organic matter over the years, but the soil still retains a lot of water. And this person is, I think, like many, trying to plant drought-tolerant native plants, but most of them tend to need pretty sharp drainage.
Yeah. Clay, unfortunately, can be a difficult one to answer for. Organic matter is definitely a good option, but it's very hard to change a soil's texture overall. So one of the things that could be beneficial here is installing some kind of drainage, like a French tile or something like that, a drain tile or a French drain. That can help with drainage. One thing I would caution against is I've heard of folks digging a hole, putting in potting soil, and then planting their plant in that with the regular soil around it. If you do that, you can change the osmotic potential between the native soil and the potting soil that you've put the plant in, and there can be an issue with water filtration between the two. So you can actually end up causing your plant to die of drought because of that. So I think if you've added a lot of organic matter and you're still having issues with it, maybe installing a drainage system is the best way to go. The other thing I'd caution against is if you do have really heavy clay soil, don't try to add sand. You'll make concrete.
Yeah, I've gotten that beware tip for my own clay soil with sand. Um, okay, I think I'll move us along because there's other questions instead of my own brain follow-up. Someone's curious about if there's options for making a pond without using a pond liner. They said that they know they could go, for instance, buy like bentonite clay, but what can they do with their native clay?
Oh, good
It's just
question.
compaction. Yeah, general recommendations.
So let me think about that for a second. There are native bentonite clays in Oregon. Um, the issue would be if you're using a kaolinitic clay or a different sort of species or class of clay, when they dry out, they tend to crack and it can be hard to hold water in there. So I think more research is probably needed on that one.
Mhm. Great. Okay, so moving more into like small, maybe more like urban. Let me see. There's so many questions. I'm trying to ask similar questions in a row, but you guys have so many really great questions this week. It's really fun. Um, could you speak a little bit about how what you've shared, and this is a more open one, relates to raised garden bed management?
Sure. A lot of what we're talking about still applies to raised bed garden management. It's good to keep living roots in the ground. We definitely want to add organic matter. The differences would be, how far down are we working? Tillage typically doesn't happen in raised beds. You can hand turn often with a broad fork, or if it's a small raised bed, like a 3x4 or something like that, it may be easier to do with a trowel. It's still good, however, to try to keep those soil practices going. We want to add organic matter, keep living roots in the ground, maximize biodiversity when we can. But also keep in mind that we don't want to overcrowd the beds if we can. Think about root penetration and root stability and keeping those plants alive and healthy too. If we overcrowd a bed, and for example, let's say we're doing fruit bushes, I know I've hit blueberries a couple times, but I'll keep them on the example. If we plant too many blueberry bushes in the same raised bed, we can create a humid environment that'll allow for pests like spotted wing Drosophila to proliferate. So we want to think about above ground and below ground.
Thanks very much. How much depth of soil would be needed to grow most food garden plants? This person
Ooh.
is this person particularly is dealing with fairly shallow basaltin areas. And they have a lot of organic material they could add where they want to establish a food garden, but are curious if there's a magic blend ideal for building usable soil depth.
Unfortunately, while soil is the magic ingredient, there is not a magic blend specifically for this. I think well, it really depends on the crop. So for example, daikon radish and carrots may require 12 to 16 inches, where on the other hand, blueberries produce an extremely shallow root, so they can be grown in thinner soils as long as they have adequate water to them. So I think choosing a crop that's right for your soil can be really good. So some of the brassica family have shallower soils or shallower soil requirements, that kind of thing. The other part of that, though, is making sure that you're getting adequate water to the plants if they're in a shallow soil and not overwatering too. We don't want to create a really hot environment or a really humid environment.
Cool. Thank you. Manure-based composts tend to have high salt levels, and for garden soils that already have high levels of phosphorus, do you have any fertilizers you would recommend?
Mm. There are a lot of organic mixes out there that are low in everything. So like a 002, which would not be the one to use in this case, but choosing something that's lower on the fertility scale and only focuses on the particular nutrients that you need would be a good option here. And there's so many options. The other thing you could do is focus on specific nutrients. So you could go get potash or, for example, bone meal if you're specifically focused on increasing your nitrogen or your potassium, something like that.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on biosolids? And maybe for the good of the group, could you talk about what biosolids are?
Sure. So there's kind of two things with biosolids. We may be talking about human waste. That's what I'm familiar with when we're talking about biosolids. I typically would not add that into, we wouldn't add that into a home garden or anywhere where we're going to be growing food in.
Okay, great.
And for the person who asked that, if you're referring to a different kind of biosolids, let me know.
I'll keep an eye on chat. We've gotten through a lot of the questions, so I'm feeling pretty good about us. I was worried for a little bit that we might not have enough time, but we've been whizzing through them. So I want folks to know that you can still absolutely send any other questions in chat. I'm going to put the evaluation link for today, even though we still do have a few more minutes in case folks have to hop off early. But back to you, Logan. Someone wrote that they are wondering if you have any, which one do I want to ask? Someone's curious to hear recommendations for cover crops that would also help with winter protection for other plants. Basically a cover crop that won't totally die off in winter.
That will or won't?
That won't totally die off in winter, like
Oh,
in
good
the Portland
question.
area.
So I'll preface this by saying that that's going to largely depend on where you live and what the average and minimum temperatures are. And I will make a quick plug for OSU Extension here and say that we have a wonderful resource list. So feel free to check out the OSU Extension website when looking for anything from cover crops to nutrient recommendations for whatever you're growing. I tend to go with a cereal and a legume mix, and that will vary depending where you live. But something like clover and rye or walking oats and clover can be a really successful thing that'll overwinter in your field. The main caveat there is if you're going to grow a cover crop that does overwinter, you want to make sure to terminate it before it seeds, unless you want that there forever.
That's great. And what about, aren't there sterile wheat that you can get?
There are some sterile varieties. You just want to make sure that you're purchasing that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks. Are there any resources, Logan, that come to mind for you for native plant selections by soil type?
Oh, I love that.
Yeah,
So the big thing I would recommend is talking to your local master gardeners. Every chapter of the Master Gardeners has something called a plant clinic. I can actually hear ours is just starting in the other room. And Plant Clinic is a wonderful resource for you to talk to folks who are in your community, familiar with your soils and growing native plants. There are also a few different resources on the Master Gardener website, that's through OSU Extension, that talk about pollinators and regionality with those pollinators and native plants too.
awesome. Yeah, Gail had responded to that in chat, and she also she said that she hasn't seen a guide, like a specific guide like that either. But the closest thing that Gail could think of would be looking at plant communities and choosing other plants that occur with the community you have. And
Awesome
so
idea.
for that, OSU Extension has a Pacific Northwest Native Plants by Plant Community. And that is linked in there for folks in chat. So we'll be capturing all of these links that have been popped in and sending out those resources and recommendations. I want to, Logan, speaking of links, I had that soil test link in mind. Was that something that you were gonna plug, or did I just miss my cue to put the soil survey or soil test?
Oh, so that's not a soil test link. That was in regards to the first question we had. So we'll be putting a link in the chat here in a moment for the USDA soil survey or the web soil survey. And that'll give you a little more insight on what kind of soils you have at home. So it dials it in a little bit more than you may be used to. It'll tell you what series you have or what member of the taxonomic order you have. And that can give you an insight into what your soil looks like top to bottom, literally. So from what you can see without digging all the way to the bedrock. And that can be really beneficial when deciding what to plant, especially if we're thinking about planting crops or plants that do well in our soils on their own.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So related to learning more about our soils, do you recommend soil tests? And if so, what type of kit and where should people send them in?
Sure. So there are a million different soil test kits out there. What they typically do is tell you your NP and K, your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. One thing that's really important to think about is that there are a lot of accredited labs, even some here locally in Oregon, that can give you really dialed in results. OSU actually has a document showing all the different soil testing labs in Oregon and maybe in the States. I'd have to double check that part. But it's a really good idea to send your soils off to an accredited lab to at least start with, and then you can compare the results of those kits next to that and see if they're serving you correctly, if they're close to accurate. The labs typically use more calibrated methods to give you accurate results, and they also offer more than NPK typically.
Thanks very much. A lot of Clackamas County in the urban areas is seeing a lot of rapid development. And in some cases, that looks like the topsoil being scraped off and then just the clay heavy soils underneath being essentially exposed. Could you talk about how gardeners should approach that type of soil?
Oh, like if they've moved into a place and they're right at the B layer?
I think if I remember the layers right, I think that's what it would be, yeah.
Sure. So there's a couple options there. You can lay soil on top and try to incorporate it, but like I said earlier, it's very hard to change soil texture. So another option is looking for plants that do well with poor drainage or in clayey soils. There's a few options there. And once again, referring back to the extension website, talking to your master gardeners, and then I saw somebody through the garden ecology lab in the chat. That's another place to look that has really good resources for kind of trying to match your soil types to what kind of plants can go there.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I'm scrolling through. Some of the questions have come through directly, so I just want to make sure I'm not missing any. Could you speak a little bit about or to how soils have changed since pre-European settlement and colonization in the Willamette Valley?
That's a big topic. But yes, there definitely has been some changes. With urbanization and buildings going up, there's definitely going to be a difference in the soil that we have. Also, through construction and other processes of turning cities into cities, we're going to have mixtures of soils that happen so they're just not native anymore. You know, if we have a load of soil that gets pulled off of a lot so that a building can be put there, it has to be put somewhere else, right? And so that can fundamentally change the soil profile, A, of where that topsoil has been pulled off, and B, wherever that topsoil ends up. There also were cultural practices that may not happen in certain areas anymore. So, for example, burning may not occur in every place that it used to, and that will change the soil profile. So, in some places, you can go and actually, when you take a soil sample, you can find these charcoal deposits, you know, in that profile, and that can show us kind of a history of what may have occurred there beforehand, which is A, really cool, but B, may not happen or occur as much as it used to. And then as modernization of agriculture has occurred, we're adding more fertilizers, different kinds of chemicals and different kinds of pesticides, which are going to change the profile a little bit too.
Thank you so much, Logan. This has been such I love it's been a fast-paced and really, really informative conversation. I don't have any other questions coming through, so I popped the evaluation link once more in chat for folks. And unless we're seeing anything else coming through, I think we might be good to go. So please, folks, filling out that evaluation link is really helpful for Michelle and the other folks at the Environmental Learning Center to plan this Wildlife and Water-Friendly Gardens series. Michelle, do you want to come on and tell us what we'll be learning about next week?
Yes, hi. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Logan and Gail, for your introduction. Really lots and lots of information. And if you didn't catch every single thing, we will be sending out the recording with a lot of those links to you on Monday. So that if you didn't get everything. So next week, we will be on to our 5th presentation. It will be on plant tolerances to weather extremes. So we will be introducing Amy Whitworth back again, who's from Earth Friendly Garden Design. Planet Earth, that's right. So she'll be talking to us about that topic. And very much looking forward to that. Very relevant, as was, I mean, all of these have been fantastic. So thank you so much to our presenters and to Alexis for having a very difficult job today to moderate and field all those questions. So really appreciate you doing that. And I think we are about done for today. Anything else you wanted to say, Alexis?
Just another thank you really to Logan and also Gail for
Yeah.
helping respond to some of those questions on chat. There were a couple I didn't convey because Gail responded with a few resources, and yeah, this was just really great. Everything I learn about soils, I get more excited about soils. And Logan, it was really fun to learn from you.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? So much information, really interesting to learn about. So thanks everybody, and hopefully we'll see you next week for plant tolerances to weather extremes, and don't get too cold out there.